That express mail envelope came from the office of Gerald Marsh. He was a renowned attorney and also my stepmother Sandra's most loyal errand boy. Inside was a copy of a will. It had been signed in November 2023. I turned the pages with trembling hands. The black words hit me like hammer blows. All of my father's assets, including his bank accounts, real estate holdings, and 100% ownership of Livingston LLC, had been left entirely to Sandra. My name was nowhere on the list of heirs. His only son, the man who had stood beside him through thick and thin on construction sites across the country, was left with nothing. And that was not even the end of it. Her attorney bluntly threw me out before my father's body had even gone cold. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. My name is Thomas Livingston. My father, Robert Livingston, started with an old beat-up truck and just $12,000 in his pocket. He sweated on construction sites. He measured every angle with absolute precision. Livingston LLC was not just a construction company. It was blood and sweat reputation and the load-bearing wall of our entire family. 110 workers depended on it for their livelihoods. But in the early days of 2026, that load-bearing wall collapsed forever along with my father. He passed away suddenly after a stroke. While the entire job site was still in shock, while I was drowning in the darkness of grief, Sandra appeared. She was my father's second legal wife, a woman 29 years younger than him. Over the years, she had always worn the mask of a warm, devoted, and caring wife. But on the very day of the funeral, I saw the chilling coldness hidden behind that carefully crafted black veil. While sympathy flowers still lined the walkway, and the soil on my father's grave had not yet dried, Sandra could not wait any longer. She walked into my father's office with a disgusting sense of urgency. There was not a single tear of grief in her eyes. There was only greed and calculation. She began rummaging through everything. She checked the safes. She wanted to dismantle the entire empire my father had spent half a century building. That betrayal felt like a hammer striking directly at my trust. I looked at that woman and realized she had never loved my father. She had only loved the shadow of the vast fortune he left behind. Anger and disgust surged through my chest. The house that had once been filled with laughter now contained nothing but the suffocating presence of dark schemes. To understand why Sandra could act with such cruelty, we have to go back to the year 2007. That was the year this woman entered my father's life. At the time, she was only in her 20s, while my father was already an older widower. Sandra possessed a sweet appearance and a calculated warmth. She quickly worked her way into his life. Then she worked her way into the very machinery of Livingston LLC. My father loved her. He believed he had found a peaceful harbor for the second half of his life. Because of that love, he put her in charge of the company's administrative and human resources operations. Sandra was very intelligent. She made herself an indispensable link in the office. She managed records, controlled contracts, and coordinated personnel. To my father, she was a dependable partner behind the scenes. But to me, she was like termites quietly eating away at the foundation of a major structure. I began noticing the first cracks 3 years earlier. As the chief engineer, I kept a close watch on material expenses. I discovered unusual invoices. They were payments made to unfamiliar subcontractors, companies that appeared nowhere on our blueprints or at any of our job sites. The amounts were not large enough to bring down a business, but they appeared month after month. I brought the documents to my father. I warned him that there was a weakness in the company's financial structure, but his response disappointed me. He simply smiled and told me I was being overly sensitive. He said Sandra was doing an excellent job, and that those expenses were reasonable costs for maintaining business relationships. My father's love had blinded the judgment of a seasoned builder. He had no idea that he was nurturing a traitor in his own bedroom. Sandra knew I suspected her. The way she looked at me became increasingly cold and guarded. She began isolating me from major decisions at the executive office. She used her influence to create a wall between my father and me. I chose to remain silent and focus on the southern job sites where real buildings were actually rising from the ground. I thought that as long as the company continued to generate profits, her petty schemes would never be able to shake this empire. That was the greatest mistake of my life. I had underestimated the greed of a venomous snake. She did not just want to steal a few dollars through fake invoices. She wanted much more than that. She wanted to seize the entire enterprise my father had spent a lifetime building with his own sweat, and her opportunity arrived the moment my father drew his final breath. Her preparation was so thorough that it left me completely shaken. Exactly 48 hours after the funeral bells had fallen silent, an express mail envelope from an unfamiliar law office arrived on my desk. That horrifying event destroyed my entire world in a single second. The express mail envelope left me stunned, but it also ignited a fire of rage that burned through my chest. This was an insult. It was a direct slap in the face to my father's memory and to my own honor. I immediately rushed to my father's house. I wanted answers from that woman. But the moment I stepped through the door, I no longer saw the devoted wife she had pretended to be. Sandra was sitting in my father's armchair. She sipped her tea with an air of superiority. Beside her sat Gerald Marsh in a perfectly pressed suit. The attorney looked at me with open contempt. He did not even give me a chance to speak. Instead, he presented a written notice that left no room for discussion. Your father has been buried. Take your belongings and get out. That was the cold message the attorney threw in my face. He declared that I no longer held any authority whatsoever at Livingston LLC. I had exactly 5 days to collect my personal belongings and leave the office. I was also required to move out of the house where I had grown up. Sandra looked at me with open defiance. She said times had changed and that I should accept reality. Her greed was now fully exposed. She was dismantling this empire before the flowers on my father's casket had even begun to wilt. I stood there with my fists clenched so tightly that my fingernails dug into my skin until it bled. I wanted to expose her disgusting true face. I wanted to scream to the entire world about this injustice, but I saw the smug smile on Sandra's face. She was waiting for me to lose control. She wanted me to make a mistake so she could use the law to get rid of me even faster. The frustration rose into my throat and nearly choked me. My audience, can you imagine this pain? Less than 3 days after losing my father, I was being thrown out of my own home like a beggar by the very woman he had loved. My family's entire legacy had fallen into the hands of a scheming outsider. I turned and walked away in utter humiliation. The sound of my shoes striking the floor echoed with loneliness and bitterness. I stepped outside, got into my truck, and looked back at the house one last time. I made a solemn vow. I would not fall. I was the son of a builder. I knew how to rebuild from ruins. I drove off into the darkness of the night. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Why had my father signed such a insane will in November of 2023? I was going to find the answer to that mystery. The rage inside me did not turn into a reckless outburst. Tired people make bad decisions. That was something my father always reminded me whenever a project ran into trouble. Sandra wanted to see me lose control. She wanted me to smash things so she would have a reason to call the police. But I was a builder. I knew that when a structure is on the verge of collapse, the first thing you do is not scream. You find the original blueprint and determine where the design failed. I did not return to the job site. I did not seek sympathy from the workers who had always stood by me. Instead, I drove straight to the office of attorney Kevin Mercer. Kevin was my father's oldest friend. They had known each other since the days when they shared loaves of bread on wind-swept scaffolding. He was the keeper of Livingston LLC's deepest secrets. When I walked into Kevin's office, he was not surprised to see me. His aging face carried a frightening calm. He slid a cup of hot coffee across the desk and told me to sit down. Kevin looked directly into my eyes and said something that left me speechless. He told me that everything happening was unfolding exactly as my father had planned. I stared at him in disbelief. Kevin explained that my father had never been as blind as I thought. He may have loved Sandra, but he was also a practical man. A seasoned builder develops an ear for the slightest crack in a foundation. In September of 2023, 2 months before that insane will was created, my father had begun noticing troubling signs. Sandra's carefully crafted warmth had started to reveal its flaws. My father realized that his young wife was quietly gathering documents and working with Gerald Marsh. He never confronted her. He understood that once greed takes root, resistance only forces a snake to become more cunning. Instead, my father chose a silent and remarkably sharp strategy. On a stormy evening, he arranged to meet Kevin at a remote roadside diner outside the city. There, the two men drafted an entirely new blueprint. It was a secret plan to protect his legacy, one so confidential that even I was not allowed to know about it until this very day. Kevin opened the wall safe and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He placed it on the desk and smiled mysteriously. He said the November 2023 will that Sandra possessed was completely authentic. My father had personally signed it in the presence of legal witnesses. Sandra truly would inherit the entirety of Livingston LLC exactly as she had hoped. But the smile on Kevin's face told me that something far more disturbing was hidden beneath the surface. My father had left her the empty shell, but the structural steel core of the building had already been moved elsewhere. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated switch, and every detail of it was contained in the stack of documents resting on Kevin's desk. I opened the file on attorney Kevin's desk. Each page revealed a truth that left me completely stunned. My father had carried out an extraordinarily ruthless corporate restructuring strategy in October of 2023. That was 1 month before he signed the will, leaving everything to Sandra. He called it the empty shell strategy. With the foresight of a master builder, my father had quietly established a family trust in my name. The trust was completely independent and protected by strict legal safeguards. After that, he performed what could only be described as major surgery on Livingston LLC. Every one of the company's most valuable assets had been legally transferred into that trust. The modern construction equipment fleet, the intellectual property rights to the company's core project designs, the prime parcels of land being held for future development, even the lucrative contracts with major partners had been amended through transfer provisions. In the end, the financial benefits flowed directly into the trust that carried my name. The Livingston LLC that Sandra had been so eager to possess still appeared to be a giant from the outside. The company still occupied an impressive office. 110 workers were still laboring at job sites every day, but in reality, its core had been completely removed. It was nothing more than an empty shell. I sat frozen in my chair. A powerful wave of pride and emotion rose inside me. My father had never betrayed me, nor had he allowed his judgment to be clouded by the calculated warmth of his younger wife. He had used silence to conceal a flawless protection plan. He had allowed Sandra to celebrate a victory that did not exist. He gave her exactly what she wanted, a company name on paper. But he left the blood, sweat, and future of the business to his only son. Kevin looked at me and explained the brilliance of the trap in greater detail. Sandra and her attorney Gerald Marsh had become too confident in the will. They were so focused on calculating the day they would seize control of the assets that they forgot one of the most basic rules in construction. Before accepting a completed structure, you inspect the structural plans. They had never performed a thorough legal audit of Livingston LLC's current assets. They saw only the company's reputation and the profits it had generated in previous years. That arrogance would become the graveyard of their ambitions. At that moment, Sandra possessed a company burdened with enormous operating liabilities from ongoing projects. Meanwhile, every major revenue stream and income-producing asset was safely under my control. Kevin told me to continue acting. I needed to appear defeated. I needed to seem resigned. Most importantly, I had to let Sandra believe she had won completely. I nodded. A clear plan for retaliation was already taking shape in my mind. I would hand Sandra the keys to the sandcastle she believed she had conquered. But before the trap could fully close around her, a smug text message arrived on my phone from Sandra. The message contained a demand that would force me to confront her face to face. My phone screen lit up in the darkness. The message from Sandra was short and dripping with arrogance. She wrote, "Let's handle this like adults." She wanted me at the Livingston LLC office on Monday morning to sign the documents transferring all management authority and surrender the keys to every job site. I looked at the message and smiled bitterly. A hunter always believes he is the one doing the hunting until he realizes he is the prey walking into a trap. Following Kevin's plan exactly, I sent a brief reply. I agreed to hand everything over without the slightest objection. On Monday morning, I walked into the company headquarters dressed in simple clothes. I was no longer the powerful chief engineer I had once been. I played the role of a defeated man, a son stripped of his inheritance, wearing the expression of someone broken and resigned. Sandra sat in my father's executive chair. She wore an expensive designer outfit. Her bright red lipstick and sparkling eyes radiated triumph. Gerald Marsh stood beside her with a stack of legal transfer documents, already prepared. My calm demeanor made them completely careless. Sandra believed I had surrendered to the power of the November 2023 will. She mocked me, saying I should find work at another construction site more suited to my manual labor skills. I did not respond. I quietly signed every transfer document. I placed the master key to the warehouses and equipment yards on the desk. My decisive actions and strategic silence acted like a sedative, making their greed even blinder. They laughed and celebrated right in front of me, convinced that the Livingston Empire now belonged entirely to Sandra's side of the family. What they did not know was that they had just accepted ownership of a structure whose foundation had already been stripped of its steel reinforcement. What they possessed was nothing more than an empty shell. The material debts and payroll obligations for the month would soon come crashing down on them. I packed a few personal notebooks and left the office. As I walked through the hallway, I glanced at the workers carrying out their duties. I knew they would be safe. My trust had already established measures to protect their jobs. Sandra and Gerald Marsh were far too eager to celebrate their imaginary victory. They immediately filed a petition with the Superior Court of Maricopa County seeking an expedited ruling recognizing Sandra as the sole and lawful heir. That was exactly what Kevin and I had been waiting for. We needed a public stage, a place where every card would be turned face up under the light of justice. At last that day arrived. The Maricopa courtroom was packed. Sandra appeared more polished than ever, ready to assume control of what she believed was a multi-million-dollar fortune. But the moment the judge instructed Gerald Marsh to present a detailed inventory of Livingston LLC's current assets, something disastrous happened at the witness stand. The attorney's face suddenly changed color. Every trace of blood drained from it. The atmosphere inside the Maricopa courtroom was suffocating. The quiet murmurs of the spectators drifted through the room before falling silent as the judge entered. Sandra sat at the opposing table. She wore an elegant black suit. Pearl earrings shimmered beneath the courtroom lights. Her face radiated confidence and triumph. She looked at me with contempt as though I were nothing more than a pitiful, defeated man. Beside her attorney, Gerald Marsh wore an arrogant smile. He calmly arranged his legal files. He was completely relaxed. He believed the November 2023 will was a block of concrete that could never be broken. To them, this hearing was merely a simple administrative step to legitimize their takeover of Livingston LLC. I sat quietly beside attorney Kevin Mercer. Not a single emotion showed on my face. My composure was like the surface of a calm lake before a violent storm. The judge struck the gavel and instructed Sandra's legal team to present a detailed inventory of the company's assets and its current net value so the inheritance proceedings could be completed. Gerald Marsh rose confidently to his feet. He opened the company's asset inventory report and prepared to read it into the record. But the moment the veteran attorney's eyes landed on the figures printed on the page, the smile vanished from his face. The hand holding the documents began to tremble. He hurriedly flipped to the next page. Then another. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. His face drained of color. Sandra immediately noticed something was wrong. She leaned forward and snatched the documents from her attorney's hands. If you've stayed with the story this far, then it must have captured your interest. Please take a moment to help us out. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for the ending to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Sandra stared at the figures on the current balance sheet. Her eyes widened in horror. The expensive makeup on her face could not conceal the panic spreading across the features that had once been so smug and self-assured. She read the numbers again and again. The result never changed. The empire she believed she had successfully seized was now nothing more than financial wreckage. The entire courtroom began to buzz with speculation as Sandra's side remained unusually silent. The judge struck the gavel a second time and ordered Gerald Marsh to provide the official figures. Gerald swallowed with difficulty. He glanced helplessly at Sandra before turning back toward the bench. His voice cracked as he spoke a number that left every person in that courtroom utterly stunned. A number so shocking that the entire room seemed to freeze in disbelief. Gerald Marsh's trembling voice echoed through the silent courtroom. He stammered as he reported that the current net asset value of Livingston LLC was $0. The entire gallery immediately erupted in shocked murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Spectators leaned forward in their seats to make sure they had heard correctly. $0. For a construction empire once worth tens of millions, it was a shock no one had anticipated. Sandra completely lost control. Her carefully crafted elegance vanished in an instant. She sprang to her feet, knocking her chair backward. Bloodshot eyes blazed with sudden fury. Pointing directly at me, she screamed across the courtroom, "What did you do to the company? Where did you hide the money?" I rose slowly from my seat. I adjusted the collar of my suit with deliberate calm. Then I looked directly at the panicked woman standing before me. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone waited for my answer. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm but sharp, carrying to every corner of the room. "I didn't do anything. My father did it 18 months ago. You didn't inherit a company. You inherited a name and an empty shell buried in debt." My words hit her ambitions like a sledgehammer. Attorney Kevin Mercer immediately stepped forward. He presented the legal framework my father had established in October of 2023. Every core asset, every major piece of equipment, every parcel of land, and every high-value contract had been legally transferred into the trust bearing my name. Sandra's November will was completely valid. It simply applied to an empty shell. Sandra collapsed back into her chair. Her expensive pearl earrings swayed helplessly. At that moment, she realized that her late husband had outmaneuvered her in spectacular fashion. Her calculated warmth had collided with a load-bearing wall she could never break. She had spent years trying to dismantle an empire, only to inherit little more than a stack of worthless papers. Gerald Marsh wiped beads of sweat from his forehead. He understood that legally they were powerless. They could not sue me. Every transfer had been executed while my father was fully competent, fully aware, and entirely within his rights. The trap had closed perfectly. But this satisfying reversal was not the end of the story. I looked at Sandra as despair settled across her face. I knew the moment had come for the final blow. I did not merely want to reclaim what belonged to me. I wanted her to pay dearly for her greed and betrayal. Attorney Kevin Mercer smiled. Then he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a second file. This was not documentation related to the trust. It was a confidential forensic audit prepared by leading financial experts. When Kevin placed the file on the judge's bench, I saw Gerald Marsh begin to tremble. Not just his hands, his entire body. He already knew what was inside, and he knew that what came next would not be a dispute over inheritance. It would be the beginning of a criminal case from which Sandra would have no escape. The second file was opened before the judge. It contained the results of a detailed forensic audit that had been conducted over many months. Attorney Kevin Mercer's voice rang through the courtroom, silencing the last remaining whispers. Kevin began revealing the truth. The audit showed that Sandra had abused her administrative position to embezzle a total of $263,000 from Livingston LLC. During the 14 months before my father's death, she had created dozens of fraudulent invoices. They were fabricated expenses submitted through phantom subcontractors that she had created herself. Month after month, a steady stream of money was siphoned from the company's accounts and transferred directly into her secret personal accounts. Sandra sat alone in her chair, her face as gray as ash. Her greed had left behind a trail that could not be erased. When copies of bank statements bearing her own signature appeared on the courtroom's large display screen, she completely unraveled. Gerald Marsh lowered his head toward the table. The attorney understood that this was no longer an ordinary inheritance dispute. It was now a serious criminal matter. Embezzlement on that scale carried the potential for a lengthy prison sentence. The satisfying justice I had waited for was unfolding right before my eyes. I looked at the woman who had thrown me out of my home only 48 hours after my father's funeral. Now she trembled like a leaf in the wind. Justice had not come from an emotional outburst. It had come from a precise blueprint and the extraordinary caution of my father. I walked toward Sandra's table. I did not look at her with anger. I looked at her with complete contempt. Then I slid a prepared settlement agreement across the table. I offered her one final choice. Sandra would sign a document surrendering every claim, every right, and every interest connected to the Livingston name Livingston LLC and any property my father had left behind. In return, I would not seek criminal prosecution based on the embezzlement findings. She would keep her freedom, but it would be a freedom marked by poverty and humiliation. Sandra looked down at the agreement. Then she looked up at me with pleading eyes. But my heart had become as cold and solid as concrete toward the person who had betrayed my father. Her hand shook as she picked up the pen. Tears of bitter defeat filled her eyes. Then she signed. Her greed had dug the hole. She was the one who had climbed into it. When the final legal procedures were completed, I walked out of the Maricopa courtroom as the undisputed victor. I had reclaimed my father's legacy. But as I stepped into the bright sunlight outside, I understood that the real challenge was only beginning. 110 workers were waiting at the job sites. They were waiting for the true leader of the company to return. And for the first time since my father's death, I was ready to go back and finish what he had spent a lifetime building. The blazing Arizona sun poured down as I returned to the southern job site. The roar of excavators echoed across the property. The sharp clang of hammers striking steel beams created a familiar symphony. The company was still operating normally. The 110 workers out there still had steady jobs. When they saw me, they waved in unison. The foundation my father had left behind had never been shaken. His protective blueprint had kept our shared roof standing strong against Sandra's storm of greed. I walked into the executive office and sat down in my father's old chair. On the desk, a photograph of him smiling beside the battered pickup truck he owned in 1977 still sat in its place of honor. At that moment, I realized something profound. My father was a builder, and builders always think about what will happen after they are gone. He had seen the cracks forming in people's hearts long before anyone else. He did not use violence to solve the problem. He used strategic silence and the law to reinforce the structure of his life's work. My family's story is not merely a lesson about revenge. It is a lesson about remaining clear-headed in life. Many of us allow emotions to cloud our judgment when dealing with the people closest to us. But remember this: love and caution are not opposites. You can love someone and still read the contract carefully. Never hand over the master key to your life without having a backup plan to protect yourself. Build your life on clear principles and proper accountability. Do not allow someone else's calculated warmth to strip the steel reinforcement from the home you have worked so hard to build. Thank you for joining us on Dad's Real Life Revenge. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another hard-earned lesson. I returned home after nightfall. The large house felt peaceful and calm. The presence of deception was gone. The dark schemes hidden behind sweet words had disappeared. I walked into the small kitchen and turned on the stove to prepare breakfast for the next morning. It was a simple meal, exactly the kind my father used to make himself. No shortcuts, just heat and patience. The patience to wait for everything to cook evenly. The patience to rebuild from ruins and make something stronger than before. The legacy of a builder was never the money Sandra had tried to steal. It was the integrity, discipline, and precision my father had passed down to me. My daughter-in-law sprang to her feet, walked straight over to my wife, and shouted in her face, "Get out of here right now. That clacking sound is so annoying." That was how she opened her own birthday party. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they just chose wrong. Leave a comment with the number 1, so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. It was a summer evening in Manhattan. The glow of chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling reflected off sparkling crystal glasses. The laughter and conversations of the upper class filled the room without pause. Ethan, my son, stood beside his wife. Both of them wore expensive, custom-designed outfits. They smiled brightly as they welcomed influential figures from the business world. My wife, Megan, and I were seated at a table tucked away in a corner. My wife had recently endured a long illness. Her legs had grown much weaker. Every step required the support of an old wooden cane. As soft orchestral music played in the background, Megan wanted to use the restroom. Holding on to the edge of the table, she slowly rose to her feet. Her wooden cane tapped against the marble floor, producing a faint clacking sound. That sound felt completely out of place in such a luxurious setting. Mia was standing nearby. She immediately turned around. Her eyes swept over Megan's outdated coat before stopping on the cane. Her expression hardened. Without a moment's hesitation, she hurried over. She spoke loudly enough for 3 nearby tables to hear. She said my mother's presence was ruining the group photos with important business partners. She treated the presence of her mother-in-law as an inconvenience. And she did not stop there. In a harsh tone, she ordered my wife to leave. It was a level of disrespect that could not be tolerated. I did not look at Mia. I turned and looked at Ethan. My son stood there. He glanced at his watch and then looked away. He did not defend his mother at all. He stepped closer and lowered his voice, but his irritation was unmistakable. He told his mother to listen to Mia. He said she did not fit the sophisticated atmosphere of the event. He advised us to take a taxi home early so we would not ruin everyone's good time. My wife was stunned, tears welling in her eyes. Her hand trembled as she gripped the cane tightly. The wrinkles on her face tightened with hurt. Yet she remained silent and did not argue. Megan had always been that way, spending her entire life enduring hardship for her children. The ingratitude of the son we had raised cut deeply into the dignity of both of us. I remained seated. I did not get angry and I did not raise my voice. I simply stayed silent. The silence of a man who had already traveled through nearly all of his life. I looked directly into the eyes of my son and my daughter-in-law. I wanted them to know what was about to happen to them right now. In my mind, a major decision had already been made. I slowly rose to my feet and adjusted the collar of my suit jacket. I walked over to Megan and took hold of her frail arm. I supported her by the elbow. She leaned her full weight against me. The clacking of her wooden cane echoed once again, slow and solitary, as we made our way toward the exit. The entire banquet hall suddenly fell silent. Every eye turned toward the two elderly people being quietly shown the door. Mia smiled faintly, the look of triumph obvious on her carefully made-up face. Ethan let out a sigh of relief. Perhaps he thought the problem had finally been solved, but they were wrong. My silence always came with a very expensive price. From the central table, Arthur rose to his feet. He was the chairman of the largest investment firm in Manhattan, and also the man Ethan had practically begged for 3 months just to secure a meeting with. Arthur did not say a single word. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket and stepped away from the table. He did not look at Ethan, nor did he spare Mia a glance. He walked straight toward me. Behind him, 2 other billionaires from the banking industry's board of directors stood up at the same time. They silently followed him. That powerful silence seemed to drain all the air from the room. The entire ballroom froze. The smile on Mia's lips stiffened. Ethan's face turned pale. He stammered as he called Arthur's name, but the chairman never looked back. They walked alongside my wife and me, protecting the dignity of the true founders. Arthur's black limousine was already waiting, with its engine running at the entrance. He personally opened the door for Megan. Only after my wife and I were comfortably seated in the back did Arthur look at me, give a slight nod, and signal for the car to leave. Throughout the ride home, the interior of the vehicle remained completely silent. Megan stared out the window, watching the city lights drift by. She did not cry, but her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I took hold of my wife's icy hand. I knew her heart was broken because of the son she had brought into this world. Ethan's coldness was a fatal knife wound in a mother's heart. I watched the first streaks of rain begin to gather on the window. In the darkness, I smiled calmly. Ethan and Mia believed they had climbed to the very top of high society. They were proud of their $1 million apartment and their rapidly growing company. But those 2 arrogant children did not know one truth. The foundation beneath their feet had been built entirely by my own hands. When the limousine stopped in front of our old house, I helped Megan out. I pulled out my phone and called the family's private attorney. My voice was calm but sharp in the darkness. I instructed him to prepare every document related to the secret trust fund. It was time for the ungrateful to learn what it felt like to lose the support they had always taken for granted. Early the very next morning, a confidential letter was delivered directly to Mia's office, carrying a terrifying secret capable of destroying her entire career overnight. The morning sunlight streamed through the window of our old house. On my desk sat the trust fund documents that my attorney had delivered earlier that morning. I flipped through the pages one by one. Ethan and Mia's names appeared under the beneficiaries section, but ultimate control still belonged to me. For many years I had deliberately chosen to stay in the background. I wanted my son to become independent. I wanted him to understand the value of hard work. But that generosity had created an ungrateful monster. The luxurious Manhattan apartment that Mia proudly showed off on social media had actually been purchased with money from this fund. Even her fast-growing media company would have gone bankrupt 3 years ago if it had not been for the financial backing I provided. My son and his wife were living inside an illusion of their own making. They believed their success came entirely from their own talent. They looked at elderly, modest people like us with contempt, treating us as a burden. I took a sip of hot tea. The bitter taste spread through my throat, mirroring the bitterness in my heart. No matter how magnificent a house may appear from the outside, if its foundation is built on sand, even a gentle breeze can make it sway. People are no different. When they forget their roots, when they forget those who sweated and sacrificed to pave the road before them, their collapse becomes only a matter of time. At that moment, photos from the previous night's party were beginning to flood online news outlets. Mia posted a lengthy article boasting about an upcoming international project that was about to be signed. She carefully edited out every trace of my wife and me. Ethan shared the post as well, adding words of praise for his wife. They were intoxicated by a false spotlight. What they did not know was that 3 of their most important business partners had just withdrawn their names from the guest list for the upcoming signing ceremony. My dignity could endure an insult, but the dignity of my old friends could not. I closed the file. The covers struck together with a dry sound. Megan entered the room, still holding her wooden cane with trembling hands. She looked at me with sad but understanding eyes. She did not ask me to forgive our son. She simply sat down in the chair across from me. The silence shared by 2 elderly spouses inside that large room carried an overwhelming weight. It was the silence that comes before a great storm. At that moment, the phone on my desk began to vibrate. The screen displayed my attorney's number. I answered immediately. The lawyer's voice lacked its usual calmness. He informed me that he had just uncovered an extremely unusual move from Mia's family. Mia and her parents had been secretly carrying out something outrageous behind our backs. They were targeting Megan, my loyal wife, with a scheme so cruel that it was beyond forgiveness. The attorney's voice on the phone was quiet, but every word that reached my ears felt like a stream of ice water. My in-laws were trying to gain access to the central hospital where Megan had undergone medical evaluations the previous month. They were using money and connections to bribe an associate department chief. Their goal was to alter my wife's medical records. They wanted to portray her as someone suffering from severe dementia, no longer capable of sound judgment. I kept the phone pressed to my ear. I did not interrupt, nor did I reveal so much as a sharp breath. I rose from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at the small yard where Megan was carefully watering her rose bushes. A woman who had spent her entire life being kind, who had never harmed even an ant, had now become the target of a hunt driven by the greed of her own son and daughter-in-law. If Megan were declared legally incompetent, control over the assets registered in her name within the trust would automatically pass to Ethan. That was why Mia wanted her mother-in-law pushed out of the party. She wanted to create the public impression that Megan was no longer mentally fit. Greed had blinded them. They did not just want money. They wanted to trample the dignity and the life of the woman who had brought one of them into this world. I ended the call. The phone felt cold in my hand. I returned to my desk and stared at a family photograph taken 10 years earlier. Back then, Ethan had been a good boy who would run to hug his mother whenever he came home from school. Now the greed of the woman beside him had transformed him into a heartless accomplice. When the moral foundation of a person has rotted away, they become capable of the most disgusting acts without feeling a trace of guilt. They wanted to test the strength of the foundation. Very well. I would show them the weight of a structure built over 40 years. I opened a secure drawer and removed a small voice recorder. It was the device my trusted assistant had used to capture an entire conversation between Mia's father and the associate department chief at a discreet cafe. Every piece of evidence, every amount of money discussed, had been recorded with undeniable clarity. I gripped the recorder tightly in my palm. The father's voice, sharp and chillingly calm, echoed through the empty room. I did not send the evidence to the police immediately. Nor did I call Ethan to warn him. A true hunter always waits until the prey reaches the peak of its arrogance. I knew that 3 days later Mia's company would be hosting the signing ceremony for its international resort project. That would be the place where all of their glory was displayed, and it would also be the place I had chosen to bring everything to an end. What I did not expect was that very same evening Ethan would drive to our old house on his own, carrying a sinister contract in his hands. The engine of a luxury car came to a stop in front of our old house. The car door opened, and Ethan stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored suit, though the exhaustion on his face was impossible to hide. He did not look at his mother, who was sitting beside the tea table knitting. Instead, he walked straight toward me and placed a stack of documents on the table. In the tone of a busy executive, he explained that the papers were an authorization agreement for asset management, supposedly to make investing in a new project more efficient. He claimed that because his mother's health had declined recently and her memory had become unreliable, it would be better for the entire family if the assets were placed under his control. I looked at the documents on the table and then raised my eyes to my son. He checked his watch twice within a single minute. To him, sitting in this old house and speaking with his parents was nothing more than a waste of valuable time. He was eager to return to Mia's glamorous world. I did not touch the pen he offered me. I simply remained silent. My silence lasted so long that Ethan began to grow uneasy. He started rambling about the future, about the enormous profits the international resort project would supposedly generate. I stood up and walked over to Megan. I placed a hand on my wife's frail shoulder and felt the faint tremble that ran through her body as she listened to the lies coming from our son. Then I turned and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. I told him to go home for now because I needed time to review everything carefully. Ethan was clearly displeased, but faced with my firm refusal, he reluctantly gathered the documents and stormed back to his car. Once the sound of the engine had completely faded into the distance, I turned on my computer. On social media, Mia had just posted a new photograph. It showed the corner of her luxurious office along with an arrogant caption about financial freedom and self-made success. Praise poured in from her followers like rain. They admired her as the embodiment of achievement. I read the words with complete calm. Not a single ripple disturbed my thoughts. They had soared so high because of the money flowing from my trust fund, and they genuinely believed they had reached the stars. I shut down the computer. Then I picked up my phone and called the largest partner involved in the international resort project, the owner of a multinational construction corporation. I did not use dramatic threats or grand speeches. I simply provided one brief piece of information regarding the true ownership structure of Ethan's company. I informed him who actually held ultimate authority behind the capital that guaranteed the entire operation. Every legal document had now been returned to its proper place. I was ready for the final act. The blueprint for the downfall of the arrogant had been completed. Tomorrow's international signing ceremony would be where I appeared to reclaim everything that rightfully belonged to me. What I could never have anticipated was that Mia had already prepared another vicious move to block my path. The event hall of a five-star hotel in the heart of the city was flooded with flashing cameras. A grand display bearing the name of the International Resort Project signing ceremony stood prominently at the main entrance. Ethan and Mia occupied the center of the hall. Dressed in their finest attire, holding glasses of wine, they smiled constantly as they posed for photographs with reporters. Confidence and arrogance were written across their faces. I entered through a side entrance. I had chosen a simple black suit, no flower on the lapel, no badge of distinction. Calmly, I walked to the last row of seats and quietly sat down. Not a single camera lens turned toward me. Not a single security officer bowed in greeting. To them, I was merely an old man who had wandered into the world of the wealthy. From a distance, Mia spotted me. Her expression shifted briefly before she quickly signaled for two large security guards to approach my seat. She walked over and positioned herself so that reporters could not see us. Lowering her voice, she spoke with a sharp, threatening tone. She said this was an international-level event and that people without official business or membership credentials should leave immediately to avoid ruining the image of the occasion. She even implied that I had come here to tarnish her and Ethan's reputation because of what had happened at her birthday party. I did not stand up. I did not become angry. I simply looked directly into the eyes of my arrogant daughter-in-law and offered a calm smile. I told her she should take another careful look at the list of people who actually owned this project. Mia let out a contemptuous snort. Then she turned away and ordered the security guards to remove me. Just as the two guards were about to place their hands on my shoulders, the ceremony's opening music filled the hall. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, his voice booming through the powerful sound system. He announced that the signing ceremony was officially beginning. Ethan and the representative of the multinational construction corporation walked together onto the stage of honor. The entire audience erupted into applause. The MC began delivering the opening remarks. He respectfully introduced the largest shareholder, the person who held ultimate decision-making authority through 60% ownership of the entire resort project. This individual was also the true owner of the investment fund that financially backed Ethan and Mia's company. The entire hall held its breath, waiting to hear the name of a powerful figure from the financial world. Ethan proudly adjusted his tie, preparing himself to welcome the billionaire he had admired for so long. When the MC announced my name through the microphone, every spotlight in the hall immediately swept across the audience before stopping directly on the seat where I was sitting. Mia and Ethan froze where they stood, their faces twisted in shock as a horrifying truth shattered everything they thought they knew. It was a reality far beyond anything they had ever imagined. I rose to my feet beneath the spotlight. Slowly I walked toward the stage. The sound of my leather shoes striking the wooden floor echoed with a dull rhythm. The entire hall fell silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on me, the old man, who only a minute earlier had been dismissed as someone who did not belong there. Ethan stood frozen in place. The color had completely drained from his face. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The pen he had intended to use for the signing slipped from his fingers and rolled across the glass table. Mia stood with her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide with fear. I stepped up to the podium. I did not look at my son or my daughter-in-law. Instead, I faced the board members and international investors seated before me. I did not need to shout into the microphone. With the calm, seasoned voice of a man who had lived through decades of experience, I began presenting the facts one by one. I publicly disclosed the documents showing how Mia's company had manipulated financial records to conceal bad debt. I presented evidence, proving that funds had been withdrawn from my trust without the approval of its founder. With every statement I made, the murmurs among the investors grew louder. They exchanged uneasy glances before turning toward Ethan with anger in their eyes. The representative of the multinational construction corporation immediately rose from his seat. He withdrew the contract that was moments away from being signed. Panic overtook Mia. She rushed toward me, attempting to seize the microphone. Stammering, she claimed that I was lying, that I was a cruel father trying to destroy his own children. I remained silent and took a single step backward. I had no need to argue with her. My attorney stepped onto the stage and placed another file on the table. It contained recorded evidence of the scheme to falsify Megan's medical records in an attempt to seize her assets. At that moment, the entire cruel truth was laid bare before the public. Outrage swept through the hall. Reporters fired off photographs without pause. Flash after flash illuminated Mia's pale face. I turned toward Ethan and announced that I was withdrawing 100% of the investment capital backing the company, effective immediately. The carpet beneath the feet of the arrogant had been completely pulled away. The collapse happened instantly. International partners turned their backs and walked out. The signing ceremony became the biggest embarrassment of the year. Mia crumpled onto the stage floor, expensive makeup streaking down her face with tears of humiliation. Ethan looked at me, his lips trembling as though he wanted to beg for mercy, but I had already turned away and begun walking toward the exit. The hollow foundation beneath them had finally given way. Yet the real punishment awaiting the two ungrateful souls was only the beginning of a far more devastating chain of tragedies than they could ever have imagined. If you've followed the story all the way to this point, then perhaps you've found it interesting. Please help us with one small and quick favor: like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for how the story will end to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. The media storm swept across the city overnight. Ethan and Mia's names flooded newspapers and news sites, not as successful young entrepreneurs, but as financial fraudsters and ungrateful children. Their downfall unfolded with terrifying speed. Once the financial backing from my trust fund was withdrawn, Mia's company immediately plunged into insolvency. The banks did not sit by and watch. They swiftly froze every account and seized the remaining assets belonging to the two of them. Just 2 days after the signing ceremony, their luxurious Manhattan apartment was sealed off. I stood across the street and watched quietly. Ethan and Mia stood on the sidewalk in the early season cold. Beside them were 5 cardboard boxes containing the few clothes and personal belongings they had left. Mia was no longer dressed in designer labels. She wore a simple coat. Her hair was disheveled, and she constantly tapped numbers into her phone. She called the people who had once praised her at exclusive social gatherings. But all she received were unanswered calls and abrupt hang-ups. Society's indifference toward those who no longer have money can be brutal. When you are at the top, everyone wants to be your friend. When you fall, they treat you like a contagious disease. Ethan sat hunched over on a cardboard box. His face was buried in his hands and his shoulders shook uncontrollably. He had lost everything: his reputation, his career, his wealth, and his self-respect. He glanced at Mia and then stared into empty space. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone. In its place was the misery of a child stripped of every layer of protection. They were finally experiencing what it meant to have no home and no money, just as they had once been willing to cast an elderly mother aside. I turned away without a trace of sympathy. A foundation built upon lies and ingratitude can end only one way. They would have to learn how to rise from the ruins they had created themselves. Over the next 2 weeks, nobody knew where Ethan and Mia had gone. They disappeared completely from Manhattan's elite circles, but I knew that material punishment alone was never enough for a child who had lost his conscience. The true torment would come when they realized they had lost the most valuable thing of all. Then, on a late afternoon, as the largest thunderstorm of the year poured over the city, frantic knocking echoed through the front door of our old house. It brought with it a heartbreaking sight, one that left Megan unable to hold back her tears. The rain hammered relentlessly against the metal roof of our old house. Thunder and wind howled outside the windows. I sat in my familiar wooden chair, holding a cup of tea that had long since begun to cool. Megan sat across from me, slowly knitting a sweater for the coming winter. The peaceful atmosphere inside our home felt completely detached from the chaos raging in the outside world. Then suddenly a frantic pounding echoed through the house. The knocking was forceful, mixed with muffled sobs coming from the other side of the wooden door. Megan flinched. Her frail hands froze in place. I gently rested my hand on my wife's shoulder, signaling for her to remain seated. Slowly I rose from my chair and walked toward the living room window. Pulling back the curtain slightly, I looked through the rain-streaked glass. Ethan and Mia were kneeling on the ground in the middle of the yard. Their clothes were soaked through, clinging tightly to their bodies. Mia bore no trace of the arrogance she once carried. She cried uncontrollably while lowering her forehead to the concrete again and again. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Ethan knelt beside her, gripping the windowsill with both hands as he called out for his mother through sobs. He apologized over and over. He begged his parents to open the door and give them a chance to survive. They had nowhere left to go. No money, no home, no one willing to help them. Megan saw the scene through the glass. Her hands began trembling violently. Tears rolled down cheeks marked by age and hardship. She started to rise from her chair. She wanted to open the door. She wanted to embrace her son. But I stepped beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. I shook my head. The silence between us carried an enormous weight. I turned back toward the window and looked directly at my son, kneeling beneath the storm. I did not hate him. What I felt was a profound sadness. People often discover regret only after they have lost everything. The remorse displayed beneath that curtain of rain did not come from understanding what they had done to a mother. It came from needing shelter from the storm their own choices had created. I did not unlock the door. I remained motionless behind the glass, allowing their cries to be swallowed by the relentless rain. The words of a father echoed quietly through my mind, calm yet sharp as a blade. Some foundations once cracked beyond repair are not rebuilt. All that remains is to stand back and watch them collapse. It was too late for salvation. That night, the two broken figures eventually staggered away through the storm in complete despair. By the time dawn arrived, the old house stood nearly empty. Megan and I had packed our belongings the night before. We stepped outside and climbed into the car, ready to begin an entirely new chapter of our lives. Behind us, we left one final legacy, one that would make Manhattan's entire upper class bow their heads in respect. The sound of ocean waves gently rolled onto the white sandy shore. Breezes carrying the salty scent of the sea drifted across the porch. 3 months after that stormy night, Megan and I had moved to a peaceful coastal town. This morning, warm sunlight flooded the small yard. My wife sat in a wicker chair, the peaceful smile having finally returned to her face. Her hands no longer trembled as they once had. She was flipping through photographs of the charitable foundation that bore her name. Before leaving Manhattan, I used every remaining dollar from the trust fund to establish the Megan Foundation. It is an organization dedicated to providing support and medical care for elderly people living alone, for fathers and mothers abandoned by their children. I wanted to transform my family's pain into something meaningful for others. Members of high society and many former business partners generously contributed to the foundation. They respected us not because of wealth, but because of the moral legacy we had chosen to leave behind. I walked over and placed a warm cup of tea into Megan's hands. Together we looked out toward the distant sea. Money can buy a seat at the most luxurious banquet table, but it can never buy respect or love within a family. Too many young people today spend their lives chasing status and recognition. They view the aging and slowing of their parents as a burden. What they fail to realize is that those quiet figures standing in the shadows were the ones who laid the very first bricks in the foundation of their lives. If you see your parents as a burden, pause for a moment. That silent presence may be the very foundation keeping your life from collapsing. A house that loses its moral foundation will one day crumble no matter how tall it stands. Ethan and Mia paid an enormous price to learn that lesson. Today they are working long, difficult days on a farm in a remote rural area, earning just enough to survive. I have not given them another cent. It is the only way for them to rebuild the part of themselves they lost. Thank you for staying with Dad's real-life revenge until the end of this story. If this story gave you something to think about, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps stories about respect and kindness reach even more people. I took Megan's hand in mine. Together we had weathered every storm, and now it was finally time to enjoy true peace. In the end, the greatest happiness in life is growing old with someone whose shoulder you can still lean on and carrying a heart that is calm, content, and free of regret. I stood outside my son's house on my grandson's birthday. He blocked the doorway and said, "Dad, wait outside. This party is for family only." This winter was colder than usual. The wind cut across my face like a knife. But the cold outside was nothing compared to Desmond's words. My son, the child I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. He stood there leaning against the expensive oak door. A glass of red wine rested in his hand. He looked at me with unfamiliar eyes. The suit he wore was elegant. I recognized the gold cufflinks on his sleeves. They were the gift I had given him when he received his promotion. Now that same arm was pushing me away. "Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, a snack, get comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to." Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. The story begins inside the mansion. Soft lo-fi music filled the air. Wealthy guests laughed and chatted warmly. I could hear the footsteps of Lachlan, my 8-year-old grandson, running through the house. I could smell the strawberry cake, the cake I had stood in line to buy since 5 o'clock that morning. The box felt heavy in my hands. The red ribbon had begun to soak through with rain. Desmond glanced at it. Not a flicker of emotion crossed his face. He spoke quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. He said my presence embarrassed him in front of his wife's family. His father-in-law was a wealthy millionaire. I was only a retired schoolteacher wearing a worn-out coat. He had forgotten where the executive chair he sat in had come from. He had forgotten who had paid for the scars of his past mistakes. People often choose to forget a constant once they discover a new variable with greater value. To Desmond, I was a constant that no longer served any purpose. I did not argue. I looked directly into his eyes. His arrogance was important data. I took note of that data. Then I turned and walked away. The door slammed shut behind me. Decisive. Cruel. The sound of the lock echoed through the night. I walked down the granite steps. The snow began falling harder. I did not throw away the cake. I carried it back to my empty house. Desmond's calculation looked perfect on paper, but he had forgotten one thing. Every balanced equation demands a price when one side is wounded. I pulled out my phone. The screen showed no new notifications. I smiled. My silence has always been the beginning of an appropriate punishment. Desmond thought he had won when he closed that door. He had no idea that with his own hands he had just triggered a chain of consequences that could never be reversed. That night I sat down at my desk. I opened my blue notebook. At 11:47 p.m., my phone began exploding with 98 missed calls. 98 missed calls. My phone screen kept flashing in the darkness. A faint blue glow illuminated the strings of numbers. Desmond was panicking. I knew that very well, but I did not swipe the screen to answer. I set the phone back down on the desk face down. Silence is a language that weighs 1,000 pounds. especially when the person on the other end of the line knows they have made a mistake that cannot be undone. I turned on the old yellow desk lamp. The room filled with a still, quiet light. In front of me lay a blue leather notebook. Its spine had worn thin with time. This was not an emotional diary filled with personal feelings. To me, it was a data archive. Documentation is not revenge. It is evidence of a pattern. In mathematics, an event that happens once may be random. Twice may be unusual. But when it repeats for the 14th time, it becomes a systematic error. It becomes a pattern of betrayal. I turned the pages one by one. The soft rustle of paper echoed through the silent night. Each page marked a point in time. Each point in time was a financial and emotional indictment. I reread the lines written in my own hand. The pain was gone. All that remained was the cold objectivity of a teacher grading a problem that had been wrong from the beginning. November 14th, 2022. Desmond hosted a housewarming party for his first mansion. I brought a Chinese evergreen and wished him peace and prosperity. He told me to leave the plant in a corner of the backyard because he was afraid it would ruin the feng shui design of the living room. March 12, 2024. His wedding anniversary celebration. My name was not on the guest list. Desmond texted me and said the party was only for business partners. September 20th, 2025. I was hospitalized with acute chest pain. The doctor needed a family member to sign the consent forms. I called Desmond 3 times. He did not answer. The next day, he sent a short message. He said he was busy signing a $2 million contract. He said I could take care of myself because I still had health insurance. 14 times. 14 coordinates on a graph showing the decline of morality. Desmond thought his lies were clever. He thought I was a forgetful old man who could easily be fooled by excuses about being busy. But he forgot that I was a mathematician. I do not look at words. I look at the frequency and nature of the data. My son's coldness did not happen in a single day. It was an exponential function tied to the growth of the wealth in his bank account. As his income increased, the value of his father in his eyes decreased in inverse proportion. The phone vibrated again, the 99th time. Desmond was trying to reconnect an equation that had already broken apart. He was beginning to realize that one side of the problem was changing. The white envelope I had given him before leaving was not a desperate letter from a rejected father. Inside that envelope was a piece of information capable of overturning the entire upper-class life he was trying to build. He wanted to know what I was holding. He wanted to know why a retired old school teacher could make his millionaire father-in-law turn pale at the mention of his name. I looked at the blue notebook. I looked at the phone still vibrating across the desk. Desmond still believed this was nothing more than an old man's emotional outburst. He did not yet understand that when a teacher has closed the gradebook, every explanation becomes meaningless. I stood up and opened the old safe in the corner of the room. There was no gold or silver inside. Only a thick file dating back to 2020. The year Desmond had come to his knees before me begging for a lifeline. The file rested neatly in my hands. The papers had faded to a pale yellow over the years. I flipped through receipt copies and checks stamped and verified by the bank. The memories of that year came rushing back immediately. It had been a year of upheaval. It was the moment when the equation of Desmond's life had nearly collapsed to zero. That year, Desmond threw himself into business like a moth rushing toward a flame. He pooled together his money and started a technology distribution company. But the market froze. Supply chains broke down. Business partners walked away. He found himself standing on the edge of bankruptcy. One night in the middle of a torrential rainstorm, Desmond came running to my house. He no longer carried the arrogance he wore today with a glass of wine in his hand. He dropped to his knees on my living room floor. His knees pressed into the old worn carpet. He cried desperately. He said that if he could not come up with $370,000 within 48 hours, he would face prison because of debt and insolvency. He would lose everything. $370,000. For an old math teacher, it was an enormous amount of money. It was every dollar I had received from selling the ancestral home left to me in the suburbs. It was my entire retirement savings accumulated over 35 years of teaching. Desmond looked at me with pleading eyes. He promised to repay every cent. He promised to take care of me when I grew old and weak. I did not hesitate. I did not create a balance sheet to determine whether I would profit or lose. That is what fathers do. We do not ask whether the price is fair. We only ask whether the equation works. My calculation at the time was very simple. On one side stood my entire life savings. On the other stood my son's future and his honor. I chose the second side. I signed the paperwork to withdraw my retirement funds in a lump sum. I sold the piece of family land filled with memories. I transferred the entire $370,000 into Desmond's account. I willingly moved into this cramped rental apartment. Desmond took that money and soared. He saved his company. He met Wallace Ashford. He married Simone. He stepped into high society. He began buying mansions and trading up to luxury cars. But as his net worth increased, he began performing a different calculation on the past. He searched for ways to reduce the value of the debt he owed. He started treating that $370,000 as an obvious obligation any father should have fulfilled. He forgot that the money had not fallen from the sky. It was sweat. It was sacrifice. It was an entire lifetime spent standing at a classroom chalkboard. I ran my hand across the old file. Numbers do not lie. Desmond believed he had repaid his debt with a few inexpensive holiday gifts. He thought a father's sacrifice could be assigned a cash value and then erased from the ledger. But he was wrong. The nature of a debt never truly disappears. It only changes from one form into another. Desmond forgot an extremely important detail from that rainy night. When he received the money, he was in too much of a hurry. He signed a stack of documents that my best friend and I had prepared. He never carefully read the attached terms. He had no idea that behind those $370,000 a legal trap had already been activated. That trap was called Clause 14. I set down the file from 2020. Then I pulled out a document bearing an official red seal across its pages. It was the formal loan agreement. It had been drafted by attorney Thaddeus. Thaddeus had been my university classmate. He was a specialist in corporate financial law, a man with a cold mind and the precision of a computer. That night, Desmond signed this document without the slightest hesitation. He was overwhelmed with relief at having the money that would save him. He flipped through the pages in seconds. He signed every blank line blindly. All he saw was the $370,000 that was about to be deposited into his account. He never noticed the hidden variable buried on page 11. That variable was Clause 14. In the world of financial attorneys, provisions like this are known as hidden nuclear weapons. Thaddeus had foreseen Desmond's ingratitude. He understood the psychology of people who become wealthy too quickly. When people reach the top, they often want to erase the traces of those who lifted them out of the mud. Thaddeus once told me that a father's love was a constant in my heart, but for Desmond it was a variable that could change according to greed. We needed an insurance equation. Clause 14 was very clear. The $370,000 was not a non-refundable gift. It was a convertible loan carrying a penalty interest rate if repayment was overdue by more than 5 years. The contract deadline was October 31, 2025. Today was already 2026. Desmond was more than 6 months past due. What was the consequence of that default? Desmond had absolutely no idea. He believed that at worst I would demand the return of the $370,000 plus a little bank interest. He owned a company worth millions of dollars. He had a luxurious mansion and wealthy friends. He was confident he had enough money to throw in my face if I pushed the matter too far. But mathematics does not work that simply. Clause 14 stated that if the borrower violated the repayment deadline, the entire principal balance and penalty interest would automatically be converted into direct ownership shares of Desmond's company, not at its current market value, but at the book valuation from 2020 when his company had been worth almost nothing. That meant I was not demanding money. I was demanding ownership. According to Thaddeus's precise calculations, the original $370,000 from 2020 combined with the accumulating penalty interest over the past 6 months was now equivalent to 49% of the controlling shares in Desmond's company. I was about to become the largest shareholder, the person holding the power of life and death in the place of which he was most proud. I folded the contract. I placed it inside my old leather briefcase. Tomorrow, Thaddeus would send an official notice to Desmond's office. My son was about to face a test he could never cheat on, but I knew Desmond was not alone in this game. Behind his arrogance stood the shadow of Wallace Ashford, his father-in-law, a true old fox of the financial world. Wallace had taught Desmond how to dismiss and look down on this poor old father. But Wallace did not know that he had accidentally pushed his own son-in-law into an exponential function of destruction. and Wallace himself had already become a factor within its range. Wallace Ashford. In the business world, he was a true hunter, a man who believed that everything in life could be assigned a cash value. When Desmond married Simone Wallace's daughter, he looked at me with open disdain. He looked at my worn-out coat. He looked at the old car I drove. He told Desmond that coming from a poor family of educators was a weakness on his professional profile. He taught my son to use shame as a tool to sever his connection to the past. Desmond learned quickly. He began dodging his debt. He ignored the Friday evenings when he was supposed to make payments toward the principal he owed me. He started following his father-in-law's advice, channeling all available cash flow into a massive $2.1 million deal. This deal was supposed to be the launching pad that would take his company public. Wallace promised to invest if Desmond could demonstrate the decisiveness of a true executive. Ironically, that decisiveness turned out to be pushing his father out of the equation of his life. Greed always operates as an exponential function. When people have 1, they want 10. When they have 10, they want 100. Desmond believed he was controlling the game, but he forgot that I was a teacher. I do not merely look at the answers on a test. I look at how those answers were obtained. Last week, through several former students who now work in auditing, I obtained a set of internal documents. Desmond was deceiving investors. To qualify for Wallace's $2.1 million deal, he had falsified financial statements. He had inflated the previous quarter's revenue to 3 times its actual amount. This was no longer an ordinary error. This was securities fraud. A criminal offense. I sat alone in the dark room, turning page after page of the falsified documents signed by my own son. Disappointment rose inside me like a stream of icy water. I had taught him how to solve difficult problems. I had never taught him how to manipulate the answers. Desmond was standing at the top of a house of cards. One gentle gust of wind would bring down his entire career, reputation, and luxurious lifestyle. Wallace Ashford believed he was the apex predator in this deal. He believed he was leading Desmond by the nose and preparing to swallow his company whole. But neither of them knew one critical piece of information. The contract containing Clause 14 that I held carried greater legal authority than any of their current investment agreements. My 49% ownership stake granted me complete veto power over this $2.1 million transaction. Tomorrow morning, when the market opens, Desmond will submit his listing application. He believes it will be the most glorious day of his life. But he has no idea that an unpredictable witness has just entered the equation. A young witness, one who possesses a missing piece capable of detonating the entire media bomb before I ever have to use the law. Desmond and Wallace believed they had carefully calculated every angle. They controlled the cash flow. They controlled the media. They controlled the investors. But they could not control an 8-year-old child. My grandson Lachlan. That afternoon, while I stood outside the door in the snow and rain, the boy was sitting in the living room. He was holding a newly purchased iPad. He was testing its audio filtering feature by recording a video. The expensive oak front door could not block the device's sensitive microphone. The entire conversation between Desmond and me was recorded without missing a single word. Desmond's cold voice, the wind whistling through the crack in the door, his cruel rejection of his elderly father, the cake box soaked by the rain. Every sound was captured in the child's accidental recording. The 8-year-old knew it was wrong, but the 41-year-old man still had not realized it. Lachlan did not fully understand the meaning of his father's words. But he saw his grandfather walk away in the rain. He saw his father slam the door shut in anger. He pressed the save button. After that, the video was automatically backed up to the family's shared iCloud account. It was an automatic synchronization feature, a simple algorithm with no emotions. It merely performed its task of copying data from one device to another. At 11 o'clock that night, Simone Desmond's wife opened her computer to review photos from their son's birthday party. Instead of cheerful photographs, the screen displayed Lachlan's 30-second video. Simone sat frozen at her vanity table. She was not greedy like Wallace. She was a mother. She understood the meaning of family bonds. The naked truth revealed in the clip sent a chill through her. The man she had lived with for 10 years was far colder than she had ever imagined. Simone began questioning everything. She questioned the origin of the $370,000 that had saved the company during its crisis years earlier. She questioned why Desmond always found ways to avoid the subject whenever she suggested inviting me over to visit. The data had been exposed. and it created a deep crack in Simone's confidence and trust. At the same time, I also received a copy on my phone. I sat and watched the video play across the screen. I was not angry. I knew that what was meant to come would come. I turned off the phone. I placed the contract containing Clause 14 into a pristine white envelope. I included no note. Not a single word. I sent it by overnight courier to Desmond's office that very night. My son believed that tomorrow would be the day he reached the pinnacle of glory with his $2.1 million deal. He had no idea that when he walked into his office, a brutal financial autopsy would be waiting for him on his desk. Late at night. The lights were still on in Desmond's office on the 34th floor. He sat alone in front of the gleaming glass windows, looking down at the city flooded with headlights and neon lights. Tomorrow was the big day. The day his company would officially go public. Everything had been scheduled perfectly. He should have been celebrating with Wallace, but a bad feeling kept him from leaving the office. At 11:47 p.m., the white envelope I had sent by overnight courier was sitting on his desk. The building security guard had delivered it about 10 minutes earlier. Desmond stared at the envelope. There was no sender's name, only the seal of Thaddeus's law firm. He used a silver letter opener to slice it open. Inside was not an emotional letter of disappointment from an elderly father. Inside was a financial autopsy. It was a 20-page document. The first page was a summary of the loan from 2020. The figure of $370,000 was printed in bold black ink. Desmond turned to the next page. The color began draining from his face. The numbers seemed to dance before his eyes. Accumulating penalty interest. 6 months of delinquency. And finally Clause 14 quoted in full with his own signature beneath it. Desmond frantically flipped to the last page. There he found the share conversion calculation prepared by Thaddeus, 49% ownership of the company. Complete control over the current board structure resting in my hands. The $2.1 million deal with Wallace Ashford instantly became worthless paper without my approval and signature. The falsified financial report he was preparing to submit to the stock exchange had also been attached by Thaddeus as supporting evidence, along with a stern warning regarding securities fraud. Sweat began rolling down Desmond's forehead. He grabbed the phone on his desk. His hands shook so badly that he nearly dropped it. He dialed my number. The first call. The ringtone echoed through my empty apartment. I watched the screen light up but did not answer. The second call. The 10th. The 50th. Then 98 missed calls. He knew I was looking at the phone. He knew I was deliberately remaining silent. The silence of a teacher, while a student realizes that he solved the test incorrectly from the very first step. There is no opportunity to correct a paper that has already been turned in. He finally realized that the worn coat of the father he had thrown out earlier that afternoon was now the very thing capable of taking away the entire kingdom he possessed. If you followed the story this far, then you may be finding it interesting. Please do us a quick favor. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and predict how the story will end to see if your guess is correct. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Desmond could no longer sit still. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the office. He needed to find Wallace Ashford. His millionaire father-in-law was the only lifeline he could think of. He believed Wallace's power and money could crush an old school teacher and an aging attorney, but Desmond did not know that Wallace was holding another document in his hands. A document capable of stripping away my entire pension and driving me into ruin. This confrontation had just evolved into a new equation, one far more complicated than before. 8 o'clock the next morning. Attorney Thaddeus's office was filled with the light of the morning sun, but the atmosphere inside was ice cold. Wallace Ashford sat arrogantly on a leather sofa. Desmond stood quietly behind him. His face looked exhausted after a sleepless night. Wallace showed no sign of panic. He wore a smug smile. He placed a thin file on the glass table. Wallace looked at me with the eyes of a man who believed himself superior. He said that my 49% ownership stake was an impressive number. But mathematics only has value when a person still has the right to remain in the game. He pushed the file toward me. Inside was a report from the IRS. Wallace had used his influence to dig for flaws. He had discovered an error in my tax records from 3 years earlier, An amount of income from private tutoring had not been fully reconciled. The figure was $22,000. Wallace threatened me. He said that if I did not sign an agreement surrendering my 49% ownership stake for $0, he would submit the document to the IRS. I would face a criminal tax investigation. The remainder of my pension would be frozen. The honor of a teacher with 35 years of service would disappear into nothing. Wallace believed he had found a variable capable of completely eliminating my equation. He was betting on an old school teacher's lack of understanding of complicated financial regulations. Desmond looked at me. A cruel spark of hope flashed in his eyes. He thought his father-in-law had won. He thought my worn-out coat would once again be forced to bow before the power of money. I looked at the tax file. I was not afraid. A good teacher is never surprised by a trick question from a troublesome student. I turned toward Thaddeus. Thaddeus smiled slightly and opened his leather briefcase. He placed an original receipt on the table bearing the red seal of the United States Treasury. November 10, 2023. It was a receipt for a voluntary supplemental tax payment. 3 years earlier, Thaddeus himself had discovered the $22,000 discrepancy while helping me complete the paperwork for selling my house. I had voluntarily paid the penalty and settled the entire amount, including late payment interest, long before Wallace had ever learned of its existence. My tax record was completely clean. Wallace's counterattack failed completely. The arrogant expression on his face immediately twisted. The smile vanished from his lips. The documents in his hands had become nothing more than a harmless joke. He had calculated an equation using outdated and inaccurate data. Desmond completely fell apart. He realized that his only lifeline had just exploded. But that was not all. Thaddeus stood up. He produced an official ultimatum. If Desmond did not sign the transfer order for the 49% ownership stake before noon today, we would submit his falsified financial statements to the Securities Commission. The office door suddenly swung open. Simone walked in. In her hand was her son's iPad. There was not a trace of affection left in her eyes as she looked at Desmond. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The snowstorm outside had stopped, but the cold still lingered throughout my cramped rental apartment. There was a knock at the door. Hesitant, uncertain, I opened it. Desmond stood there. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His normally well-groomed hair hung across his forehead. His eyes were red from panic and despair. He had not come with Wallace. Wallace had abandoned him the moment he realized the $2.1 million deal had turned into a financial black hole. Desmond stepped inside. He looked around the simple apartment. He looked at the old particle board dining table. Then he dropped to his knees once again. Just like that rainy night in 2020. He cried. He begged me to sign the waiver agreement for the Securities Commission. He said that if I did not save him, he would lose everything. Simone was filing for divorce and seeking custody of their son. The company would collapse. He would go to prison. I did not say a word. I walked into the small kitchen. I turned on the gas stove. A blue flame sprang to life. I placed a small pot of water on the burner. Then I took out 2 packages of inexpensive instant noodles. The same meal we had eaten throughout the years when he was a struggling college student. Back then, I always gave him the only meatballs in the bowl. Desmond watched me cook. The sound of boiling water filled the suffocating silence. I placed 2 steaming bowls of noodles on the table. I pushed one toward him. I told him to eat. Desmond stared at the bowl. Tears dripped into the broth. He said he was in no state of mind to eat noodles right now. Calmly, I picked up my chopsticks. I told him that an empty mind cannot solve difficult problems. If you want to correct a mistake, you must first be clear-headed enough to see where the error lies. I looked at my guilty son. My heart tightened, but my face remained as calm as a teacher standing at the front of a classroom. Punishment does not change people. Understanding does. I was not using Clause 14 to destroy him, nor was I submitting his falsified financial reports to the authorities. If I did that, I would only be proving that I was successful at revenge. But I was a father. I was a teacher. My goal was to correct the mistakes on his exam, not tear the exam paper apart. I pushed the share conversion documents toward Desmond. I told him I would sign an order freezing the 49% ownership stake in order to protect the company's assets from creditors. I would save him from prison. But on one condition. He had to personally submit his resignation as chief executive officer. He had to solve this debt problem himself, starting from the most basic numbers. He had to relearn how to be an honest human being before learning how to be a millionaire. Desmond looked at me in shock. He was finally beginning to understand the true nature of the punishment. I was not taking away his money. I was taking away the arrogance that had blinded him for so many years. He picked up the pen. His hand trembled as he signed the resignation agreement. He had chosen to face the error in his life. Desmond left my home after night had fallen. He walked away carrying a heavy burden on his shoulders, but his steps were steadier than before. The lesson had been learned. The equation now had a new path toward a solution. But just as I was about to close the door, my phone received a message from Thaddeus. A final development had just been recorded at the county property registration office. Simone had made an extreme decision that even surprised me. Simone's decision came as a great surprise. She used her entire share of the assets from the divorce settlement to fully repay the original $370,000 debt to me. She did not want her son to grow up carrying the shame of having a father who refused to repay what he owed. Simone's action officially reduced the debt side of the equation to zero. 6 months later, this year's winter was finally coming to an end. Warm spring sunlight began filtering through the windows. Today was Sunday. I stood by the window of my apartment looking down at the walkway below the building. The path had been cleared of snow and carefully salted to prevent slipping. That was something Desmond had quietly been doing for the past 3 months. Every Sunday morning, before I woke up, he no longer drove luxury cars. He wore simple work clothes. The arrogance he once carried had disappeared. In its place were calmness and patience. A knock sounded at the door. Exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I opened it. Desmond stood there with Simone and my grandson Lachlan. They carried a basket of fruit and ingredients for dinner. There were no formal pleasantries, no expensive glasses of wine, and no upper-class pretenses. Desmond looked at me. The sincerity he had lost 10 years ago had returned to his eyes. He lowered his head respectfully. He called me Dad with genuine respect. Our first Sunday dinner after so many storms passed in a warm and peaceful atmosphere. At last, the equation of our lives had found a balanced solution. Desmond had accepted a fresh start at a small company in an ordinary employee position. Self-respect does not come from winning. It comes from how you fight. I watched my son correct the mistakes in his life, one by one. For a father, that was the greatest reward. Understanding had healed the wounds left by betrayal. Thank you for joining Dad's real-life revenge. Don't forget to share your story in the comments and click like and subscribe so you won't miss the next valuable lesson. I want to leave you with one thought. In life, money and status are only temporary variables. They come and go with the changing tides of time. Only family bonds and personal integrity remain true constants. Never erase from your life the people who sacrificed everything to lift you out of the mud simply because of numbers in a bank account. Every moral error carries a cost, and every error in character will eventually be balanced by a harsh equation of cause and consequence. The soft music of the banquet hall still drifted through the air. The scent of expensive imported lilies lingered beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers worth tens of thousands of dollars. Every inch of the grand ballroom screamed luxury and perfection. Then everything froze. A horrifying silence swallowed the room of 200 guests. Every head slowly turned toward the decorative planter in the corner of the hall. My wife Catherine was lying on the floor. The elegant champagne-colored dress she had spent months choosing was now smeared with thick black mud. The hem was torn apart. Blood trickled down from her scraped knees. Her face had gone pale from shock and humiliation. She was not crying out loud. The shame was too overwhelming for tears. Standing beside her with folded arms was Madison, my new daughter-in-law. A smug little smile curled across her lips. Her expensive high heels stood inches away from the muddy mess. Her pure white wedding gown remained spotless. The contrast was cruel, deliberate. She looked down at Catherine with absolute contempt. But the thing that truly shattered my heart was not Madison's cruelty. It was my son's reaction. Trevor walked over. He did not kneel to help the woman who carried him for 9 months and sacrificed her entire life for him. Instead, he wrapped an arm around Madison's waist. He leaned close and whispered something into her ear. Then the two of them laughed. Their quiet laughter echoed through the silent ballroom like knives scraping against glass. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, grab some snacks, sit back, and remember this. The people in these stories always had the chance to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Make sure to subscribe and comment the name of the city you are watching from so I can see just how far this story has reached. I stood 5 steps away from them. My entire body trembled with a rage I had never felt before. I stared at the wedding ring on my son's hand. Then I looked at the mud covering my wife. That contrast felt like a slap across my face as a husband and as a father. I had spent my entire life earning millions of dollars to give my family the best possible life. But today my own money had funded a wedding where my wife was treated like worthless trash. The character of the two people standing there disgusted me more than words could describe. I took a slow, deep breath. The cold calmness returned. I slowly pulled my phone from the inside pocket of my suit jacket and called my private attorney. He answered after the second ring. I looked directly into my son's eyes and spoke into the phone. Cancel everything. This wedding is over. Then, I slipped the phone back into my pocket. There would be no mercy anymore. Did a man who shoved his own mother into the mud deserve even a single dollar from my fortune? I ended the call. The world around me seemed to lose all sound. Everything stood still. I could hear nothing except the suffocating rhythm of my own heartbeat pounding inside my chest. The disappointment crushing me felt heavier than a mountain. That was Trevor, my son, the boy I had raised for 26 years. The child I taught to bend down and help a woman when she falls. And now he was bending down only to whisper into the ear of the woman who had just shoved his mother into the mud. I stared at him. Trevor still had one arm wrapped around Madison's waist. In his other hand was a glass of expensive champagne. His face showed no shame. To him, his mother's fall was nothing more than an awkward little accident. His weakness had reached its final stage. He was afraid of Madison, afraid of ruining the perfect atmosphere of his wedding day. So he chose betrayal instead. He chose to stand beside cruelty just to earn a smile from his new bride. My wife slowly looked up at our son. There was no anger in her eyes, only unbearable pain. It was the look of a mother realizing that the child she loved more than life itself had just driven a knife straight through her dignity. She gave the faintest shake of her head. The first tear rolled down her cheek, mixing with the black mud staining her face. She tried to stand on her own, but her legs trembled too violently to hold her up. Whispers began spreading across the ballroom. Quiet murmurs buzzed through the crowd like a swarm of insects. The luxury of the 5-star venue suddenly felt suffocating and fake. At the center of the stage stood the massive 7-tier wedding cake. It no longer looked beautiful. It looked like a monument to meaningless vanity. Madison lifted her chin slightly and adjusted her veil. Not a trace of guilt crossed her face. As the bride, she believed she had the right to rule over everyone today. She believed I would stay silent to protect the family's image. She was wrong. I walked toward my wife. Every step felt heavy but certain. I did not look at Trevor. I did not even glance at Madison. From this moment on, they were strangers to me. I lowered myself onto one knee in the dirt. I did not care that the mud stained my expensive dress pants. Gently, I lifted Catherine's trembling arm and helped her back to her feet with all the care and respect a husband should give his wife. Only then did Trevor finally take a step forward. For the first time, confusion flickered across his face. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something to ease the tension. He still believed this was just a small misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a few empty words. I shut him down with a single icy stare. If a man cannot protect his own mother, does he deserve to inherit the fortune she sacrificed her youth to help build? Then I turned and walked straight toward the center stage, where the microphone waited beneath the lights. An earthquake was about to explode in the middle of that wedding. I stepped onto the stage. The sharp sound of my leather shoes striking the wooden floor echoed through the ballroom. The massive hall suddenly fell silent. 200 guests turned their full attention toward me. I pulled the microphone from its stand. A piercing screech burst from the speakers before cutting out completely. Then came silence again, heavy, suffocating. the kind of silence people make when they know an explosion is coming. I stood tall beneath the stage lights, shining against my tailored suit. But my mind was focused on only one person. My wife. She was still standing near the corner of the room, quietly wiping mud from her trembling hands with a handkerchief. I turned toward Trevor and Madison. Madison's face had started to change color. She finally realized my calmness was not surrender. It was preparation. Preparation for punishment. Trevor, meanwhile, had instinctively moved behind his wife like a frightened child. He knew exactly what kind of man his father was. I raised the microphone. When I spoke, my voice carried through the ballroom with terrifying clarity. Calm, cold, sharp enough to cut through steel. I apologize for interrupting everyone's celebration tonight, but I believe a marriage built on humiliation and cruelty does not deserve anyone's blessing. I paused for one long second. My wife and I are leaving now. I will not stand beside evil. Not today. Not ever. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Gasps spread across the crowd. Chairs scraped violently against the marble floor. Madison's parents jumped to their feet from the head table and started toward the stage. One look from me stopped them cold. I would not allow anyone to interrupt me. Then I released the microphone. It crashed onto the wooden stage with a deafening bang that echoed across the entire hall. I stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward Catherine. I took her freezing hand into mine. Then I pulled the silk handkerchief from my suit pocket and gently wiped the remaining mud from her skin. I wrapped my arm around her shaking shoulders. Do not be afraid. I am here. Then I led her toward the grand entrance. We walked between rows of silent guests. Not one person dared step forward. Not one person dared speak. Behind us, Trevor suddenly ran after us. Dad, wait. You cannot do this. This is my wedding day. His panicked voice echoed behind me. I never turned around. I shoved open the massive oak double doors of the ballroom. My chest rose and fell beneath the weight of the decision I had just made. Together, Catherine and I stepped out into the freezing night air. The lavish $100,000 wedding behind us already looked like a ruined battlefield left behind in the dark. But Trevor and Madison had no idea yet. We were not driving home. The car tore through the darkness. Streetlights flashed across the windows, casting broken streaks of light over Catherine's face. She still had not spoken a single word. Her thin hands remained tightly clasped together in her lap. I drove with one hand while holding hers with the other. A bitter ache swelled inside my chest. What happened tonight was not some sudden outburst. It was the final explosion, after 18 months of silent suffering. 18 months. That was how long Madison had been part of our lives as Trevor's fiancée. And for 18 long months, Catherine had endured one calculated humiliation after another from the woman who was about to become her daughter-in-law. I remembered the very first family dinner. Catherine had spent hours in the kitchen preparing her traditional beef stew to welcome Madison into the family. But the moment the dish was placed on the table, Madison pushed the plate away in disgust. Too much cholesterol, too cheap. That was what she said. Catherine only forced a weak smile to keep the peace. She swallowed the humiliation for the sake of our son's happiness. But Madison's behavior only became worse. At every family gathering, large or small, she found new ways to isolate Catherine. She deliberately seated her at hidden tables far from the center of the room. The reason was painfully obvious. She did not want Catherine appearing in the glamorous photos she posted online. To Madison, my simple and kind-hearted wife was an embarrassment, a stain on the upper-class image she was desperately trying to build. The thousands of dollars she constantly asked me for designer dresses and luxury shopping stood in disgusting contrast to the way she treated the woman who gave birth to her future husband. Then tonight I finally learned the full truth behind the incident before the push. Before the reception started, Catherine had accidentally brushed against Madison's gown in the dressing room and left a small stain near the hem. Madison exploded. She called my wife a low-class countrywoman who ruined everything she touched. In front of all the bridesmaids, she planted her hands on her hips and demanded an apology immediately. Catherine was too stunned by the disrespect to respond. And when she quietly refused to bow her head, Madison never forgot it. She waited. Waited until the ballroom was full. Waited until every guest was watching. Then she shoved my wife into the mud like it was some twisted public execution. Madison believed she was the predator. She believed my wife was weak prey. What she forgot was this. She had stepped into my forest. I pressed harder on the gas pedal. A few minutes later, the car pulled to a stop in front of a towering office building in the center of the city. It was late into the night, yet the lights inside my law firm's office were still glowing. Madison believed she had only ruined a wedding dress tonight. What she did not know was that the next 3 phone calls I was about to make would destroy the entire luxury life she had only just begun to touch. I led Catherine into the private lounge inside my law office. I poured her a cup of warm tea and gently placed it into her trembling hands. "Get some rest, sweetheart. I will handle everything." Then I stepped into the office next door. The dim desk lamp cast a cold glow across my face. The entire room felt wrapped in steel and silence. It was time to use my most powerful weapon, financial warfare. I lowered myself into the leather chair and glanced at my watch. It was already late into the night, but time no longer mattered to me. I opened my contacts list. 3 phone calls. That was all it would take to completely collapse the world Trevor and Madison had built while laughing at my wife in the mud. If you were in my position, what would you do if someone humiliated your wife like that? Comment number 1 if you would keep supporting the person who shoved her. Comment number 2 if there is no forgiveness and you would cut them off completely. As for me, I chose to be the husband my wife deserved. I made the first call. The person on the other end was the luxury real estate agent handling Trevor and Madison's penthouse purchase. My $60,000 deposit for their new home was sitting in escrow. Cancel the transaction immediately. Transfer every dollar back into my account. The agent sounded confused, but I gave him no chance to ask questions. I hung up, then I made the second call. This one went to the luxury event and travel company. Not long ago I had happily signed the checks to help give them the perfect life. Not anymore. Cancel the $42,000 sponsorship package. The imported flowers. The celebrity photographers. The upgraded honeymoon package in Italy. All of it. No flowers, no glamorous photos, and absolutely no Italy. Then came the third call. My bank director answered immediately. "Freeze Trevor's supplemental credit card effective now." Just like that, more than $200,000 in financial support vanished within 10 minutes. Their luxury lifestyle evaporated into the dead silence after each disconnected call. I slowly placed the phone back onto my desk. Not a single ounce of hesitation touched my heart. Madison wanted to play queen with my money while humiliating my wife. Pathetic. That night, the 2 of them were probably still drowning in champagne and celebrating what they believed was their victory. They still thought they were royalty standing above everyone else. But by morning, reality would come knocking at their door. What I did not expect was how quickly the punishment would arrive. Just before dawn, my phone suddenly exploded with violent ringing. Trevor. His name flashed across the screen over and over again, alongside frantic banking alerts flooding his phone. The true thunderstorm of that terrifying Monday morning had begun. The phone rang violently. Its shrill sound shattered the silence of Monday morning. The clock had just struck 7. I glanced at the screen. Trevor. His name flashed over and over again. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I calmly took another sip of bitter coffee and let the phone ring through a third round before finally pressing accept. Trevor's voice exploded through the speaker. It was trembling, panicked, barely holding together. "Dad, please tell me there has been some huge misunderstanding. The real estate agency just called and said you withdrew the penthouse deposit. The hotel says my credit card has been frozen too. Madison is losing her mind right now. Please, Dad, just turn the card back on." I leaned back slowly in my leather chair. My voice remained completely calm. "There is no misunderstanding. I canceled everything myself." Trevor froze for a second before stumbling over his words. "Why would you do this? It was just a small accident." Madison was overwhelmed from wedding stress and lost control for 1 second. "Mom is not even seriously hurt. Why would you destroy my future over something so small?" The weakness in his voice turned my blood cold. I tightened my grip around the coffee cup. When I answered, my tone was still calm, but beneath it sat pure steel. "An accident. I may not understand modern technology, but I am not blind. I saw her shove your mother. And more importantly, I saw you laugh. You stood there watching your own mother lying in the mud while whispering jokes into your wife's ear." Silence. Complete silence. In the background, I could hear Madison screaming hysterically inside the hotel suite. Glass shattered somewhere behind him. Something heavy slammed against the wall. Trevor spoke again, desperate now. "I was not laughing at Mom. I was just trying to calm Madison down. Dad, please, you have to help us. The landlord said if we do not replace the deposit today, we are getting kicked out. I slowly stood up and walked toward the office window overlooking the busy streets below. Yesterday they had looked like royalty. Today they sounded like beggars. I gave him one final sentence before ending the call. Tell your wife to pay the rent with her tears. My money will never support ungrateful people. Then I disconnected. I temporarily blocked Trevor's number. Deep down I already knew this would not end quietly. Madison's pride would never allow her to accept humiliation without striking back. But what Madison could never imagine was this. Just as she prepared to make her next move against me, a third force had already entered the game behind the scenes, and it was leading her straight into a trap with no escape. After I blocked Trevor's number, their panic quickly transformed into rage. My phone finally fell silent, but Catherine's phone began vibrating non-stop beside her. Message after message flooded in from Madison. I picked up my wife's phone and read them myself. Not a single message contained genuine remorse. Every word was shameless blame directed at the victim. Madison claimed she never meant to hurt anyone. She insisted Catherine simply lost her balance and fell on her own. One message actually read, "Are you really going to ruin your son's future over something this small?" I let out a cold laugh. Shoving a woman approaching 60 years old into a pit of mud in front of 200 guests was now considered something small. When none of the messages received a reply, Madison completely lost control. She used another number to call me directly. The second I answered, her shrill screaming exploded through the speaker. "You do not have the right to do this to us. The wedding already happened. I am Trevor's legal wife now. We are family. You owe us that apartment and the money. That is my right." I listened quietly while she screamed like a spoiled child having a tantrum. The fake elegance she displayed yesterday had completely disappeared. When she finally stopped shouting, I answered with icy calmness. "You were never family to me. To me, you are nothing more than a rude stranger with no class." Then I hung up. Only moments later, Paul called. Madison's father, a man who worshipped status, money, and appearances more than morality itself. He spoke to me in the same arrogant tone he always used. "Raymond, this is just young people making mistakes. My daughter has a bit of a temper, that is all. You are blowing this out of proportion and embarrassing both families in front of friends and relatives. People will laugh at all of us." I tightened my grip around the phone. Then I cut straight through his excuses. "Paul, if you taught your daughter how to shove people into the mud, then perhaps you should also teach her how to crawl back out of financial ruin by herself. My family does not accept daughters-in-law who humiliate their own mother-in-law. Goodbye." I ended the call and blocked both him and his wife immediately. Their shamelessness had finally reached the limit of my patience. They believed family pressure and public appearances could force me into submission. They were wrong, because the real punishment waiting for Madison was not the money I had taken away. It was something far worse. The very weapon she loved most in the world. Social media. Somewhere online, a 15-second video had just been uploaded, and at that very moment it was beginning to destroy Madison's reputation in a way that could never be repaired. The very weapon Madison used to flaunt her glamorous lifestyle had now turned against her. One of Trevor's cousins had recorded the entire wedding disaster, and somehow they had captured the perfect angle. The video clearly showed Madison smirking before shoving Catherine straight into the mud. It also captured Trevor's disgusting little laugh as his mother lay on the ground. The clip was uploaded to TikTok with the hashtag #EvilBride. The power of social media was terrifying. By the next morning, the video had already passed 400,000 views. Every hour, the numbers climbed higher. Thousands of furious comments flooded the internet. Online users dug through social media accounts and quickly uncovered Madison's identity. Humiliation crashed down onto the newly married couple like a tidal wave. Friends unfollowed her overnight. Luxury party invitations disappeared instantly. Even the fashion company where Madison worked announced her suspension because of the ethical scandal surrounding the viral video. The internet had tied her to the public whipping post. But reality punished them even harder. Without my $60,000 deposit, the real estate agency immediately canceled the penthouse agreement. Trevor and Madison were ordered to vacate the property at once, so it could be given to another client. On that freezing Monday afternoon, the two arrogant newlyweds were forced to pack their own suitcases by hand. The luxury vanished overnight. Tow trucks arrived and repossessed the expensive car after the credit cards stopped working. And suddenly, they had nowhere left to go. Even Paul, despite his pride and wealth, refused to financially support his daughter. His company was already facing backlash from the scandal, and he feared further damage to his reputation. So Madison had no choice. She dragged her suitcases back to her parents' old house and moved into the cramped, messy bedroom she had not slept in since her teenage years. The woman who once acted like royalty now cried through cheap family dinners beneath a leaking ceiling fan. No more romantic nights at five-star restaurants. Only endless arguments about who would pay the electric bill. I sat quietly in my study reading the damage reports my lawyers continued sending me. And deep inside I felt something close to satisfaction. Justice had finally arrived. People who humiliate others with arrogance and money should one day experience what it feels like to lose everything themselves. And the moment the money disappeared, the cracks in their so-called perfect love story finally began to show. Madison started blaming Trevor for being weak and incompetent. Trevor meanwhile sank deeper into desperation with every passing day. Then one stormy night, drowning in anger and humiliation, my son made a reckless decision that would change everything once again. Less than a year after that disastrous wedding, their marriage collapsed completely. The ending was inevitable. A relationship built on greed and selfishness could never survive once the money disappeared. The moment the luxury vanished, their so-called love vanished with it. One violent, stormy night, frantic knocking suddenly echoed through my house. I opened the front door. A soaked figure stood trembling beneath the porch light. It was Trevor. For a moment I almost did not recognize my own son. The polished, confident groom from that wedding day was gone. Standing before me now was a broken man. His beard was overgrown. His clothes were wrinkled and drenched with rainwater. Deep, dark circles hollowed out his eyes, and bloodshot veins stretched across them from sleepless nights and emotional collapse. Madison had officially filed for divorce. She had found someone better, a newly rich businessman willing to buy her designer bags and fund her luxury lifestyle. The second, Trevor stopped being useful. She abandoned him without hesitation. Trevor dropped to his knees in front of me and Catherine. He broke down completely. His tears mixed with rainwater as they streamed down his face. Mom, Dad, I am sorry. I am truly sorry. At the wedding, I froze because I was a coward. I was terrified. Madison would make a scene and destroy the image of the party. I was selfish. I betrayed Mom because I was weak. Catherine could not bear seeing her son in that condition. She immediately burst into tears and stepped forward, ready to embrace him. But I raised my hand and stopped her. My heart ached deeply, but the experience of a father forced me to stay clear-minded. I could not allow sympathy to destroy the lesson Trevor desperately needed to learn. I stared directly into my son's eyes. The cold steel calmness returned once again. Do you understand where you truly failed? You failed because you valued your mother's dignity less than the pride of a cruel woman. Trevor lowered his head in shame. In the end, I allowed him to come home, but I did not give him a single dollar in cash. I refused to finance weakness and dependency. The next morning, I returned to my attorney's office once again. I ordered a complete revision of my will and estate protections. This time I established an extremely strict legal trust. Trevor would only inherit through tightly controlled protections, completely shielded from any future wife he might marry. Before receiving anything from me, he would first need to learn how to build a life with his own two hands. And surprisingly, Trevor accepted every condition without complaint. He moved back into his old bedroom and took a hard labor job to start rebuilding his life from nothing. For a little while the storm finally seemed over. Peace slowly returned to our family. But just as we began believing life had settled down again, everything changed the very next morning. An anonymous letter appeared at our front door, and inside that envelope waited a horrifying secret about Madison that none of us had ever imagined. That anonymous letter turned out to contain audit evidence from Madison's former company. She was not just cruel. She had also been involved in embezzling company funds before she was fired. Her endless greed finally dragged her straight into the legal system. The suspended 2-year sentence became the perfect ending for a woman who once believed manipulation and arrogance could place her above everyone else. The truth came out, and every debt from the past was finally paid in full. Time moved on. Warm sunlight once again filled our home. The living room no longer carried the artificial scent of imported lilies. Instead, the house smelled of Catherine's fresh-baked pastries drifting from the kitchen. My oldest daughter Jennifer was expecting her first child. For the first time in a long while, our family felt truly peaceful again. Catherine often sat beside the window with a gentle smile on her face, quietly knitting a small blanket for our future grandchild. The mud and humiliation from that wedding night had finally been washed away by something far more powerful: real happiness. Meanwhile, Trevor worked quietly at a small office across town. He rode a motorcycle to work every day and earned only a modest salary. He paid for every meal himself. There were no more unlimited credit cards from his father. But something inside him had changed. The weakness was gone from his face. For the first time in years, he was learning the true meaning of self-respect. Sometimes allowing your children to fall into the mud of reality is the only way they learn how to stand back up with dignity. From a distance, I watched my family rebuild itself, piece by piece. And after everything we endured, I finally understood something important. The true value of a man is not measured by how much money he earns. It is measured by what he is willing to use that money to protect. The generosity of a husband and father is never the problem. The real danger begins when we use our wealth to support cruelty, arrogance, and ingratitude. Protecting the dignity of the people you love must always come first, no matter the cost. Because the moment you tolerate evil just to protect appearances, that evil will eventually consume your entire family. Always be the strongest and most unshakable protector for the person who stood beside you through life's hardest years. If this story about dignity, justice, and family touched your heart, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next powerful lesson. And do not look away from the video appearing on your screen right now. There are many more unforgettable stories waiting for you. Click it, and I will tell you another one.